into something that we were talking about the other day at a cafe, whether morality is based on, or morality being because of luck.
Yeah.
This idea. With psychological problems, substance abuse disorders are wrapped up into it.
Yep, right.
And ultimately, I have a hard time saying to these people that it's your fault, because whatever conditions they were raised in or whoever they got involved with led to these substance abuse problems. I don't think it's an innate,
right.
thing that they're born with. And many of these personality disorders, like your father's, I don't know if it's beneficial to say it's your fault or...
But you ask, is it beneficial to say this is your fault? Before, we were asking the question, is it beneficial to say this is not your fault? Mm-hmm. Like to say to someone who has depression, everyone who's spoken to a psychiatrist will, it's not you, it's your brain chemistry. That's the standard excuse. And they hand out the SSRI drugs, they hand out the meds, get you doped up. Don't worry, it's not. Well, the opposite is say, it's you. It's nobody else but you. Like ultimately this question of if you're going to be, sad or happy, it comes in. If you're going to be honest or dishonest, if you're going to be a kleptomaniac or a law-abiding citizen, it's on you. In the past, people assumed when Koreans learn English, they speak with a Korean accent for genetic reasons. You can see how, like from a naive perspective, that seems like a reasonable assumption, right? Okay, so you're Korean, but you still speak English with this accent, and your kids also speak English with a Korean accent, so it seems genetic. That there are psychological and language motor issues, like ultimately tongue movement issues or something, that are based in DNA. Easy leap of inference to make. Scientifically, totally false. It's been totally disproven. There was a ton of research done on this, right? And in a sense, it makes sense. Like as an inference, it seems logical, right? So you see, to me, this is parallel, where you have a kind of complex behavioral problem that it's similar to speaking with an accent. Right? It's something we perform, it's something we behave. It's ultimately an attention-getting disorder, right? Why do you act depressed? A large part to get attention from people. Why do you try to look beautiful and behave in believing ways? There are social elements to this in terms of being perceived and things, right? It's not even as simple as a phobia, where it's just a feeling that rises up in you. It's something you're exhibiting and performing for other people and so on, right? It seems to me a little bit too easy. It seems to me facile just with the accent to leap to the inference. This has a physiological basis, like the shape of the tongue or the mouth. That's easy to assume. Korean people look different. The shape of their mouth looks different. So it's easy to think, oh, they have a Korean accent because of the shape of their mouth. Completely false, right? Scientifically, it's been disproven. It's easy to leap to the assumption this person has... PTSD, has certain kinds of cowardly behaviors, to be blunt. This person has certain kinds of depressed behaviors. Therefore, there's a biochemical basis, physiological basis, or genetic basis. To me, that's easy to leap to, but precisely because it's so easy, I have to try to challenge you. Well, why can't we measure it? Right. So my opening salvo was to say narcissistic personality disorder is a type of behavior. It's a type of character. It's like a pattern of behavior. It's a type of person. But is it a disease? No. And thus, is there a cure? Or is there even treatment? No. Is there a biochemical disorder or physiological basis? No. But it's a pattern of behavior linked to a type of character. So I just got a bit of an interesting question from Muhammad, who's sitting here in the same room with me, not sending me a message on Patreon or on Twitter or something. It's talking about different psychological conditions people in my life have or have been diagnosed with, and to what extent it's really useful to talk in terms of psychological diagnoses at all. And Muhammad asked, do you think this is an actual sickness? Do you think this is an actual disease we're talking about? Right away, in a sense, of course it's not a sickness because there's no cure, right? I mean, it's tragic, but okay, we have here a description of a type of person, a description of a type of character, or even you could just say a stereotype. But of course, it's not, in this sense, in terms of, he has a background in biochemistry and biology as applied to medicine. This could never match the criteria for what we consider a disease, an illness, or even a condition, right? So what do we have with something like NPD, narcissistic personality disorder? You have a description of a type of person and a type of behavior. And then we can say to what extent an individual person's behavior matches this stereotype. One of the ultimate ones is being a compulsive liar or mythomania. It can never be diagnosed because the whole psychiatric establishment and psychotherapeutic establishment is based on the assumption that a therapist can sit down with a client and that the client will be honest with the therapist. The therapist makes no attempt to verify the truth or accuracy of what the client says. It's really, if we're being honest, the tradition is based on the Catholic confession booth, right? Where it's just assumed the person sits down. So I've mentioned this before. When my father went to see his therapist, there would be no way for that therapist to judge the accuracy of his statements, or why would the therapist even suspect that the statements are a lie or misleading or what have you? A therapist would never ask. So I'm certain this happened. So my father went in and talked to his therapist about his email correspondence with me. The therapist doesn't read the emails, right? The therapist doesn't talk to me on Skype and say, look, what really happened and why. These days it'd be very easy to do. You wouldn't have to hire a detective or something. But a patient can go in to a therapist and lie. Again, it can lie for the whole session. So, what does the diagnosis mean anymore? In what sense is any description of a psychiatric condition an illness? Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? You raised a question.
Well, I don't have a background in psychology, to be honest, but I always wondered whether those diseases or psychological disorders are actually like physiologically and biologically based, or whether they're just character traits that are malleable and subject to actual conscious improvement and modification. Like if they're actually just behavioral traits, I don't think it is justified to classify them as disorders, unless you want to market it as such to for profit reasons or just to justify the job of a psychoanalyst or.
I mean, I think the more disturbing side of it is to ask: is the research being done to help people or not? Are you helping people this way?
Yeah, if you say to somebody who has this character aberration, you have narcissistic personality disorder.
Right.
This just reinforces his behavior, and because you can convince himself, I'm a victim of a disorder,
right?
And I can't do anything to change that.
Right.
I just have to accept it, and people just have to also accept that and learn to live with it.
Right.
I think it's very counterproductive.
Well, depression is an extreme example of this. Is it helpful to people to be told that their depression isn't merely sadness or sorrow or a problem? It isn't something fleeting. It isn't a rational response to conditions in their life that are making them unhappy, but that it's an innate condition, that you're born with a chemical imbalance in your brain, something already debunked in the 1980s, completely false marketing claim for SSRI drugs. Depression is not a chemical imbalance in the brain. It's been proven. We have separate videos on that. So in that case,
Can I
go ahead. Sure.
That may apply to most cases of depression, but don't you think that there are a lot of people who are depressed with no objective reason to justify it at all, and their life isn't any more miserable than any average man, and they're still depressed.
Right, but I noticed you had the word objective in there.
Yeah.
No objective reason.
Yeah, objective reasons.
So, right. But there may be subjective reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Well, and why do you subjectively perceive your conditions as such?
Right.
I think sometimes there is a biochemical basis for this disease. That is the underlying cause. But maybe in most cases.
But if that were true, that would be falsifiable, right? That'd be verifiable. So the original hypothesis that depression is produced by chemical imbalance in the brain, that it was specifically linked to serotonin and closely linked chemicals, that has been disproven. And we can test it because we can measure levels of serotonin in the brain. So it's not the case that serotonin levels are too high or too low with people with depression, these neurotransmitters, and a long series of other chemicals. Once that idea became popular and started making millions of dollars, there were other, well, maybe it's not serotonin, maybe it's this other neurotransmitter, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And one by one, they've all been tested. I mean, there's a lot of money in this area of research, and none of them have proven true. So to say, in general, if there were truth to that, that would be falsifiable. Now, the other statement you made, people can be mournful, sorrowful, miserable, with no objective reason. Well, right, but they have subjective reasons.
Yeah.
So when I was at the University of Toronto, I was incredibly unhappy. And the period of my being the most unhappy, which certainly could have been diagnosed as depression, doesn't matter, was when I was in the advanced course on Plato. This is a 400 level course, the highest level of philosophy course on Plato. And the professor also seemed to be nearly suicidal. It was so terrible, and none of the other students did the reading. I was the only student who actually read the books assigned on Plato. My life has had so many dark periods since then. I feel bad saying this is one of the darkest periods of my life. It was really, really depressing. Now, for what you just said, okay, objectively, what's bad about my life? I have a home, I sleep, I eat, I have a shower. You can say objectively, what's depressing about your life? I'm not, I'm not in a war zone or something. There aren't, obvious objective reasons for me to be unhappy. There hasn't been a death in my family or some kind of trauma. But if anyone asked me, what are you unhappy about? I could very easily articulate all of the reasons why I'm unhappy, including Canadian culture and political conditions and the kind of stuff you hear me talk about on this YouTube channel all the time. But sure, on a very simple level, the incredibly low caliber of intellectual content in my university and the crushing realization that I had no opportunities after this. This was my last opportunity to get an education. For me, there was going to be no master's degree and no PhD and no career, and not the hopelessness of my whole life looking ahead. These are subjective reasons that completely explain. But even if you just met and looked at the professor for that course, you might be even if you just sat there in the classroom and thought, yeah, I see why this is depressing. I see why listening to this guy talk about the philosophy of Plato is depressing. So my point is, you left in a caveat there. You said people can be depressed with no objective reason. Well, there are subjective reasons. But then to leap to an impossible to substantiate, falsifiable claim that is based on a biochemical imbalance. This is not easily supported. This is not easily taken up.
Okay, I have two objections. First, I didn't necessarily say that it can be explained as a biochemical disorder.
Right.
I said there may be a physiological cause for this. My second objection is that you could clearly articulate the reasons why you're unhappy,
yes,
why you're depressed.
Right.
But the people who can be diagnosed as having major depression disorder usually can't. Like, they don't even understand why they're so unhappy and why they're even suicidal. Yeah?
Right.
And you can't explain the difference between two people who live under the same conditions but have different reactions to them. You can't explain that just to environmental reasons.
Right. But also the other people
reaction to their conditions is
and theoretically the other people in the same class with me, the other people studying Plato, and maybe they're all happy, or some of them are very happy, right? And this is the point. So their subjective experience of the same course, they may be completely happy. In theory, they could have the same conditions in their life in all other ways, but they don't have my expectations or ambitions, or they're just stupid. I mean, nobody else in the class was actually reading the book. I know that for a fact because it was a seminar class. I'm just saying I heard enough. Nobody else was even doing the assigned readings of Plato. But they were happy, I guess, or happier than me. So sure, I mean, this is a difference.
I think you falsely associate depression with sadness. It's not. I don't think it's very accurate to say that depression is just merely sadness. It's more than that. It's more negative than, like, it's a really negative emotion that even makes it hard to feel like sad or happy about your condition.
So
it's more than that.
On this, I completely disagree. I really do disagree. I think that creating a category for medical depression is not something you can easily justify philosophically or medically, right? So, I mean, if you actually want to create a category and say, we're talking about something other than sadness, other than misery, you have to tell me what those criteria are and how they're measurable or falsifiable. Anything that exists scientifically, anything that's scientifically valid can be measured. And when we get into these types of claims that depression is not sadness, what is there that can
not
even
just
be
sadness, I would say.
Okay, well, it's something other than sadness. Yeah. Well, so why? I mean, I hate to put you. I know you don't have a prepared statement on this.
Yeah.
Why should we presume there's something other than sadness?
Because the diagnoses of people who are diagnosed with major depression disorder, usually they make the same claim that they lack the ability to really feel intensely about anything at all.
But that's just a 15-minute checklist. That's just a verbal interview. There's nothing defiable.
But it's consistent.
There's nothing consistent about it. In terms of also the outcomes in response to the drugs and so on. It's a 15-minute interview. How do you feel? Sad. How many days a week do you feel sad? You can look at the checklist. You can look at the same. Look, a quick parallel, because this is not exclusively about depression in this discussion. The checklist for establishing that someone is a psychopath. Psychopath and sociopath both have official tests in the United States. They are primarily used in prisons. It's just a checklist. There's nothing scientific. It's just based on interviews. You just ask them, do you feel compassion in this scenario, in this hypothetical situation? How do you feel? What happens? And then based on that interview, you're diagnosed with a supposedly innate condition. So I mean, what
So we don't even
what
think
is the basis?
psychopaths exist?
No, it's a character type. It's a type of person. It's a type of behavior. And this is assigned to people in prison based on, again, you can look at the actual interview sheets, what questions they're asked. Mm-hmm. And you or I both, probably if you just think about those questions, you could choose to give answers that you know are more likely to lead to the diagnosis, or you could choose to give answers that you know would evade it if you are motivated to do so. Yeah. So no, but I mean, depression. Recently, Unnatural Vegan talked about this. She went in and in a 15-minute interview got diagnosed with depression and then got on these drugs. That was it. So what is the empirically verifiable basis for depression or even major depressive disorder? It's pretty pathetic. I mean, there is no empirical. So again, any other condition. Let's talk about if you tell me that diabetes is a real disease. We have a blood test for that. We have empirically verifiable tests. The easiest way to test for diabetes is that we give you a very sugary drink. We give you something like Sprite, and then we measure the change in your blood sugar every so many minutes after you drink this Sprite. And we can tell, okay, one person has this condition, one person doesn't. Now, what's the other easy-to-do test? Someone who does have diabetes responds differently to the drugs, to insulin and other therapeutic treatment, than someone who does not have diabetes. So if you give the same drugs to two different people, one of whom is diabetic and one of whom is not, you get dramatically different outcomes. Okay? If you give Adderall to someone who is diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and someone who is not, it has exactly the same effects. It's not compensating for a chemical imbalance in the brain. If you give antidepressants to two people, one of whom is diagnosed with major depression disorder and one of whom is not, you get exactly the same effects. And something I've pointed out repeatedly here on YouTube, there's a split class of drugs here. There's SSRI drugs and SSRI drugs. SSRI are serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and SSRI are serotonin uptake enhancers. So they have opposite chemical effects of the brain. And if you give depressed people these two drugs with opposite chemical effects, the outcome is the same. This is smoking gun evidence that this is not a treatment for it. So this is the kind of problem we get into. Yes, being diabetic is a real medical condition, and it fits all these criteria. So why are we throwing away these criteria when we try to establish, at least conceptually or philosophically, that depression is something different from sadness and misery?
Maybe because the human psyche is not as easily quantifiable as biochemical and physiological markers.
Yeah, but if so, then
why should it be so easy to reduce it to a single
Right. Well, that is what I'm asking you though. Then how can you make the leap to saying? I mean, you started off by making the leap saying there is a biochemical basis for these psychological.
A physiological basis.
Okay, physiological basis. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
well,
why?
Well, if you make,
what is the
make
basis
the
of
observation that there are, if there are consistent observations with very striking similarities, and with no apparent, like I say, objective reason.
Yeah, but we're talking about subjective reasons, right? Go on.
Exactly. And they all describe it in the same way.
Right.
I don't think that. Don't you think there is a reason to assume? Okay, there is something physiological that is
No,
causing this.
I don't. So kleptomania. Kleptomania is stealing, basically, compulsive stealing. You would satisfy your criteria where people describe it consistently in the same way. So, is there a biological basis, physiological basis for kleptomania? Okay, bulimia. People who want to be thin and who achieve weight loss through compulsively forcing themselves to vomit. You can have a huge mass of interview data where people give similar descriptions, the same description, that they fit your criteria. Does that have a biochemical or physiological basis?
Yeah.
You think bulimia?
Yeah, but
okay.
it's a tendency. It's not like a
deterministic.
Okay.
So you think bulimia is a condition more like insulin resistance or?
No, it's a different kind of genetic influence, but it does have a genetic factor.
So how would that be verifiable? How would that be falsifiable? How would you actually test that?
Well, we have like in the major field of genetics, for example, you have a lot of traits, and you can track this in an embryo, that genes are not necessarily deterministic elements.
Right.
It depends on what they define how you react to the environment, and this like the way you react to the environment is a genetically determined trait. Yeah, but not necessarily like the resulting like phenotype, which is, for example, like PTSD or major depressive disorder. This is not directly determined by your genes, but the way you react to those certain conditions that if anybody else experienced them wouldn't necessarily lead to this kind of depression. This is certainly genetically defined.
So is there any test for that? So Tay-Sachs disease, sickle cell anemia, there are real genetic disorders, but they meet Karl Popper's standard of falsifiability. The idea that you're depressed because of your DNA, the idea that you have
obesity and diabetes,
but the idea that you are a kleptomaniac because of your DNA, or the idea that you're a bulimic because of your DNA, I do not believe there is any test for that. I don't believe there's any measurement.
Of course there is. But why do two people who eat the same diet, the same calories, one of them could become obese and the other not?
Yeah, we're talking about a psychological problem here. We're not talking about gaining.
But I'm talking. There are a lot of traits, a lot of diseases which are defined in this way. Like they're not necessarily deterministic, but they do define how your body reacts and how you react to similar environmental conditions. Like this is clearly everywhere in biology. It's not like something peculiar to psychology.
It's not everywhere in psychology. There's no genetic basis for kleptomania.
I know
you're shifting the goalposts here. I mean, okay, well, why not kleptomania? Why not bulimia? Or what is the difference between those? I take it your point is you believe that genetics is responsible for depression.
I think it has a role, of course. Maybe 50%, but it has a role.
So, what evidence could that be based on?
What's
the falsifiable or testable basis for that? Well, what can you test? Because again, if someone has
to the same conditions and see how they react differently, why? Why do they react differently?
But
where does this come from?
Your whole approach seems to be based on excluding the subjective element, which is everything here, right?
The subjective is the 50%. The other 50% is.
Okay. So if I become depressed because I'm taking a bad course on Plato, because I'm disappointed with the quality of university education, is that genetic? Why would that be a genetic difference between me and the other people in the class? If one young woman is obsessed with being thin, and then she takes the next step of that obsession becoming bulimia, why would that be genetic? And even if that is your hypothesis, it's fine as a hypothesis. How would you test the hypothesis? How would that be falsifiable? You're taking leaps here that are not scientific, materialistic, skeptical attitudes.
Why is she obsessed with her weight?
Okay, look, if I'm terrified of spiders, even that, so this is arachnophobia, even that is impossible to pin to genetics. And there's a pretty clear evolutionary reason to be afraid of spiders. But I mean, how is it even hypothetically possible to test for a genetic basis for depression, kleptomania, bulimia?
Well, if you have identical twins, for example, if identical twins, you can test it, and heterozygotic twins, if you subject them to the same conditions, develop different psychological disorders or none at all, then you can verify this.
Okay.
Identical twins have the same genetic makeup. Right. If both of them react similarly, the same way, yeah, and if heterozygotic twins react differently, and one of them becomes depressed and the other not, this is one way. You can find probably some case studies on identical twins and heterozygotic twins who do ask this question about depression, and it can give you an answer.
So, do you actually think the future is a genetic cure for depression?
No, I don't.
Okay. So, what is the utility of this? Because from my perspective, you're wrong at every stage of this analysis.
The utility
what would be the advantage if I believed what you are proposing?
Maybe it would be to acknowledge that some people really don't have a control, can't control their psychological well-being.
Of course.
Maybe not as well as other people can.
Of course.
This acknowledgement can go a long way in helping to relieve those people of their suffering.
Of course. Look, dwarfism is an innate condition. You're born with there are many, many different DNA forms that result in dwarfism. The fact that someone is born a dwarf may lead to a lot of frustration in their life. You know, they're physically small, they're disabled, they need various forms of surgery very often. They have all kinds of health problems. They're not strong. They're probably much more difficult for them to fall in love and have a romantic life. There are all kinds of problems. People with dwarfism, right? So if you tell me dwarfs have a higher rate of depression or other, nobody would be surprised by that. Okay, but this does not establish a genetic basis.
This is
for
an
depression.
objective reason to be depressed.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, no, it's not, because even then it's your attitude towards it. You can introduce some other dwarf who's had a great life and is very positive and who tells you, you can interview a particular dwarf who tells you, I felt lucky that I didn't have to do football and baseball and do gym class. I really felt I had a better life and things have worked out fine for me and I have a positive attitude towards it. Even if it's 1 in 100, doesn't matter. There will be some dwarf out there who subjectively had a different attitude towards that objective problem, right? So why, I mean, again, it's weird. I feel you're misrepresenting what my position is also. I feel like you're claiming that, well, as you just put it, that you said the advantage of your position is recognizing a kind of physical basis for why people have these psychological conditions. I mean, if someone is a compulsive liar, if they're responding to the stress in their life or egoic difficulties or something by lying more, to me, it is not easy to make that leap to, this guy is a liar. I mean, maybe he lies more because he's ugly in some broad sense. He's someone who's ugly and he always had to lie to women to seduce them or something. This is his experience in life. But I don't see a leap there to saying, okay, he has a genetic condition that causes compulsive lying disorder, or a genetic condition that causes depression, or a genetic condition that causes bulimia or kleptomania or anything else. I think there's a huge, huge leap there and a real misunderstanding of what it is we're talking about when we're talking about subjective and psychological problems. Now, also, the other reason I was pushing in this, I was interested to ask you, do you think gene therapy is the cure or the solution? Do you think the positive next step is going to be genetic? Because I think you would concede the point, we all concede the point, you can improve these problems philosophically by changing someone's attitude or outlook, the subjective element of it, right?
What if it doesn't work?
No, of course. But I just say, so the dwarf who is frustrated, let's say theoretically, you have a patient who comes in, they're a dwarf, and they're frustrated because they never got to play football and baseball, that physically they've been excluded and in this situation their whole lives, right? And if you can philosophically help them to take a more positive attitude towards their life and their aspirations, or if you can improve their life, let's say you get them a better job, you actually improve their living conditions and so on. Obviously, this is going to alleviate those problems. But there is nothing that corresponds to this dwarf's depression in the way that insulin corresponds to diabetes. There's no chemical imbalance to cure. There's no genetic disorder to cure. There's nothing we can counteract, you see. So again, this is kind of confirming my hypothesis and my approach on the other side. I think you're engaged in a sense, a fallacy of composition, because you're looking at it as if the nature of the problem is objective and the solution is objective. Whereas I'm saying, no, the problem is subjective. The problem is, simply put, psychological. And as such, it stands outside of these kinds of questions about physical disorders, even when your physical state is the cause of the depression. I mean, in the case of someone with dwarfism, it may be very direct. Like the dwarf just broke up with his girlfriend, and he's depressed because he says, it's so hard for me to find a girlfriend because I'm a dwarf. I have this physical disability, and now I feel like I'm going to be alone for 10 years, and I was never on the football team, and I was never on the baseball team. Obviously, his physical disability is linked to his depression. For someone in a wheelchair, it might be someone. We could have other examples like this. But still, I don't know why you can see this. It is a fallacy, I think, in the strictest sense of the term, to then say this is a genetic, condition. The dwarfism is a genetic condition, the physical. But then the attitude you take to it, the psychological suffering, the perspective on it, the philosophical reaction to it, and why you feel sad or depressed, or why you develop a behavior like kleptomania. Why people develop kleptomania is an interesting question. But, or why you develop a behavior like bulimia. I think there are so many strange leaps of inference here in just assuming, as you say, that there's a biochemical or a physiological basis for those things. That, to me, that doesn't compute at all. Yeah.
So PTSD is a curious case because it wasn't acknowledged for a long time in the army.
Sure.
And then later it got. Do you think the same applies to PTSD as well?
Can you make the question more specific? So what is the question of PTSD?
Do you also think that PTSD doesn't have anything to do with any physiological predisposition necessarily, and it's just a purely psychological problem that can be dealt with psychologically, with the change of perspective?
Well, I think that's probably the best tool we've got, even if it's very ineffective. I mean, I think the pure phobias are probably the hardest for my approach to address. Like, if someone they've always been terrified of spiders. They've always had this instinctual reaction to spiders, where it seems like innately they were just born with more fear than other people. Or someone who's just, in general, a coward. Someone who just has very high levels of fear, where there's a difference on the instinctual level innately. That's probably the weakest part of my argument. Now, I don't think, to my knowledge, I don't think that's the problem with PTSD. I don't think these are men who were already just very inclined to feel afraid or weak before they went to war. But so I would say I understand why you're challenging me with PTSD, but maybe even the kind of pure phobias like that, of just having really exaggerated fear, that's even hard. That's the hardest type of disorder for me to address, where it does seem like it's something inborn and innate, and that it seems like it has a biochemical or physiological basis. But even so, if you have someone who's always been afraid of snakes, or someone who's kind of always been afraid of everything, snakes, spider, any threat they've overreacted to, is the best way to cure that by drugging them up, by sedating them, or giving them drugs that'll calm them down. I have done some reading on this. The answer seems to be no. The answer, there are various forms of therapy, including the gradual exposure of people to spiders and control conditions, where you build up a cognitive familiarity. It's similar in terms of what we know about brain chemistry. It's similar to people learning to be parachute jumpers. That at first it's terrifying to do a parachute jump, but you build yourself up to it. You get it talked through in theory. You first do a small jump, then a bigger jump. You start to trust the parachute and the backpack. You feel confident, and then you can do it, no problem. That there is a similar kind of learning curve, and that people with arachnophobia, this has been done thousands and thousands of times in scientific conditions, that they can gradually learn to not be afraid of spiders. Or I guess the point is they can remain calm when exposed to the perceived risk of a spider. That's part of what's going on. So again, even then, I think that would be the kind of condition where my approach is the weakest, because it doesn't seem like there's a subjective role doesn't seem like there's something philosophical. The instinct is so immediate. Like the moment they see a spider or imagine a spider, they're terrified. Whereas these other conditions, there are more stages of cognition and mentation. Like if you go out shoplifting, to some extent you planned that in advance. You went to that store, you had an empty bag to put things in. There's a whole complex behavior. It's not an instant reaction. And again, bulimia, for most bulimia, it becomes a lifestyle. So they really do plan their day out. They plan their diet. They engage in these behaviors. But no, I don't see any role in any of this for a biochemical imbalance. And I can even go so far as to say, so look, what if shoplifting is linked to vitamin D deficiency? Like, wouldn't that be incredible? What if you could cure kleptomania by giving people more vitamin D? Is that even conceivable to you? To me, that sounds like a joke, a stand-up comic would make. No. Like, what if it's vitamin B12? Some really widespread. Any of these conditions, it is inconceivable to me that they could be improved. So my father's condition, being a compulsive liar or mythomaniac or something, him lying all the time, could that have possibly been improved through diet or exercise? No, and again, and the exceptions, from my perspective, prove the rule. That, like a dwarf, if he's unhappy because of his sex life, and then you actually improve his sex life, he has a new girlfriend and he's happy, sure. Or you have a dwarf who wishes he could play sports, and miraculously you give him a robot suit and he gets to play football. This is kind of ridiculous, but still, something happens in his life that actually cures. Okay, fine, there is a physical basis. There's an objective basis to these things. In my case, if I could go to a better university and study Plato in a better course or something, these kinds of things exist. But when they exist, they're irrelevant. I mean, it really is just like a meaningless distraction from the conversation we're having. If we're talking about depression or PTSD or bulimia or these other things. I think it's a genuine. The reason I push you on it, because I think it's a genuinely interesting case of, as we say in English, the road to hell being paved with good intentions. People have really good intentions in saying that there must be a physiological basis for this. So why? What does the word "must" mean there? What you're really saying is we can't let ourselves consider the possibility that there is no physiological basis. Because if we do, that would be prejudicial against these people, right? That would be judging your soul. It would be insulting to the people involved. Like, no, if we actually say, no, it's a choice for you to be a bulimic, or it's a choice for you to be depressed. You have a subjective reaction to this. And indeed, in a really weird sense, even something as fast as being terrified of spiders. This is a behavior you're in some sense indulging in. That a lot of these things, like, well, and again, I think that's the weakest side. I think the fear of spiders, because it's so immediate, as opposed to, look, you were feeling unhappy and insecure, blah, 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 and you decided to go out shoplifting for these emotional reasons, but you planned it, you brought your bag with the hole in the side, you carried out this complex behavior. No, it's on you. You're responsible for this, whether it's bulimia or, that's what you're avoiding by saying there must be. Saying you want to believe there's a physiological or biological. It's sympathetic. I think that's why it's so compelling.
In most cases, I don't believe that, but
yeah,
my claim was just that there may be some extreme cases where it is.
Right.
Physiology.
Well,
this is the only thing that I can say with a clear conscience.
Right.
But for most other cases, I would concede your point.
So I think also. Well, you haven't actually read the interviews that are used to establish a diagnosis of being a psychopath or being depressed. I think that would also explode your assumption, which it's a reasonable assumption, it's just wrong. Your assumption that people giving consistent answers to those questions establishes a real condition. So, we were talking about shingles. Shingles is a very, very common health condition, and there is a very simple checklist for do you have shingles? There's a kind of series of red spots that are in a line, shaped like a belt, and you can just ask the person, okay, so do you have the spots? You establish whether or not they have this disease. And above 99% of people in the United States of America will get this disease at some point in their lives. It's very, very common. It's very easy to diagnose, right? But if you ask someone in prison, questions like, do you ever feel guilt and shame do you ever think about how much your victims suffered after you committed this crime? There are some people who give you the self-confident, brash answer, nah, man, nah, I don't feel shit. And there are cultural reasons for that, and there are kind of idiosyncratic reasons for that. And you're going to leap from this kind of interview data, which is interesting. You're going to leap from this interview data to saying, like, oh, this guy has like a biochemical problem in his brain. His brain structure is inherently different. Like, he was born different from other people. Like, it doesn't even occur to you he's bullshitting because he's in a cage and he's being forced to talk to a psychiatrist. So whether or not it's bullshit, that this is his attitude, this is how he reacts. So yeah, Melissa, you want to talk?
Yeah, I have a question. So with this discussion of arachnophobia, how it seems to be rewiring your brain to think, or to just deal with feeling frightened, or with jumping out of an airplane, you get used to the idea. There seem to be like pathways that develop, and of course this is how we learn language growing up. There are pathways that develop in your brain. And
I was going to mention language earlier. Go on, yeah.
Part of disorders seems to be disordered thinking or thought patterns.
Right.
With depression, it's thought patterns of negative thoughts, or just feelings of anxiety that you can't seem to stop. So like, I understand what you say, and I want to say that too, or I want to believe that too, that it's just like this is a choice. And like in the case of bulimia, it really does seem like there is a physiological basis in that they feel a sense of control when they take control of like their ability to maintain their weight. This is a huge part of anorexia and bulimia. So it's like, I don't know how much of it is physiological when you're talking about these like pathways in the brain. I don't think it's biochemical in depression, but it's
right. But then also look, okay, so physiological, I got to split that into two halves. There's physiological but clinically irrelevant, and there's physiological but clinically relevant and philosophically relevant. So there is a condition, I will not get the Latin name correct, of people who are addicted to plucking the hair out of their head. You heard of this? So it has a long Latin name. The Latin name means plugging. Now, there is a physiological basis to it, which is that apparently when you do this, when you pull a bit of hair out of your head, your body releases, I think it's endorphins. Like there's a little bit of pain. The follicle, is connected to a nerve ending, and there's this momentary sense of stress and fear and pain, but then followed by some kind of calming release. Like the science has been done, right? So there is some physiological basis to the addiction that people get addicted to the feeling of pulling hair out of their head, right? So that's real. Now, is it clinically relevant or is it philosophically relevant? Because what those people need, what they do is get coached through. It's really like a life coach. As you can imagine, the ultimate cure is to get their life in order. They're miserable about something in their life, and they're acting out that stress by plucking their hair. So you can solve the stress, you can change their attitude, you can give them something else. If you want to, you can get them addicted to heroin or painkillers instead. It's not a good move. But so there is a physiological basis, but it's almost like an irrelevant distraction. You see, philosophically. Now, the other thing you mentioned briefly, I was going to mention this before. So, Mohammed, there is still no evidence on a genetic basis for language. So this also, you'll see why I mention this. Some people are going to stop listening to this point and give angry comments. What I mean is this. In the past, people assumed when Koreans learn English, they speak with a Korean accent for genetic reasons. You can see how, from a naive perspective, that seems like a reasonable assumption, right? Okay, so you're Korean, but you still speak English with this accent, and your kids also speak English with a Korean accent, so it seems genetic, that there are psychological and language motor issues, like ultimately tongue movement issues or something, that are based in DNA. Easy leap of inference to make. Scientifically, totally false. It's been totally disproven. There was a ton of research done on this, right? And in a sense, it makes sense. Like as an inference, it seems logical, right? So you see, to me, this is parallel, where you have a kind of complex behavioral problem that it's similar to speaking with an accent, right? It's something we perform, it's something we behave. It's ultimately an attention-getting disorder, right? Why do you act depressed? Well, in large part to get attention from people. Why do you try to look beautiful and behave and believe in ways. There are social elements to this in terms of being perceived and things, right? It's not even as simple as a phobia, where it's just a feeling that rises up in you. It's something you're exhibiting and performing for other people and so on, right? It seems to me a little bit too easy. It seems to me facile just with the exit to leap to the inference. This has a physiological basis, like the shape of the tongue or the mouth. That's easy to assume. Korean people look different. The shape of their mouth looks different. So it's easy to think, oh, they have a Korean accent because of the shape of their mouth. Completely false, right? Scientifically, it's been disproven. It's easy to leap to the assumption this person has PTSD, has certain kinds of cowardly behaviors, to be blunt. This person has certain kinds of depressed behaviors. Therefore, there's a biochemical basis, physiological basis, or genetic basis. To me, that's easy to leap to, but precisely because it's so easy, I have to try to challenge you. Well, why can't we measure it? Ultimately, even the tongue and stuff, you know this. They mostly do with X-rays, where they X-ray a person's face while they're speaking. Mm-hmm. Then you can measure the thickness of the tongue and the relationship between the tongue and the roof of the mouth. These are tiny measurements, but there's something you can measure there. And just like I said, it's kind of a distraction. Once in a while, there is a physiological basis. Someone actually has a deformed mouth. They had mouth cancer. They have some but that's irrelevant to this discussion, right? So the exception only proves the rule, right? Sometimes people have a speech disorder because of a morphological problem with the mouth, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Like, I just want to make a last remark. Like, if you take diabetes as an example, it's very hard to establish any genetic link whatsoever because there are so many genes that contributed to a predisposition.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it doesn't have a physiological basis.
Right. That's right.
That doesn't really establish this argument that that means it's somehow psychological or
no. I agree.
Purely environmental.
Right.
It is mostly got to do with nutrition, I know, but some types of diseases are like that. It's like, what I mean is there are so many factors and genetic elements that contribute to the disease that it's very hard to establish any direct causal link between any one single genetic.
I felt this was implicit. It was implicitly obvious. For many diseases are not genetic. You can have a bullet wound in your face that causes you language problems. You weren't born that way. It's not, but you still have a disease. You still have a problem. Yeah, and likewise, you can have a disorder that's inflicted. You can have a disability.
That doesn't mean
that's not genetic. Right, no, that's right. It is physiological, but it's not genetic.
Yeah.
Right, yes, right.
That was my point.
I think that's obvious, throughout.
Even if I can establish or think of a possible experiment to link genes with depression, for example, it doesn't mean that it isn't physiologically somehow influenced.
Right, but depression itself is not even itemizable. I mean, it's not even specifiable. It can't be measured.
Yeah,
it can't be falsified. Yeah.
I can see the point. Yeah.
Okay, was there a conclusion to this video? I don't know. The problem is not your genes. The problem is you. What am I going to tell you?
What brought up the question is narcissistic personality disorder.
Right.
Is it a real
right.
thing? And when
Right. Okay. Great.
When you're
Thank you.
diagnosed
Good.
with these...
Good. Thank you for reminding me of the point of this video. Right. So my opening salvo was to say narcissistic personality disorder is a type of behavior. It's a type of character. It's like a pattern of behavior. It's a type of person. But is it a disease? No. And thus, is there a cure? Or is there even treatment? No. Is there a biochemical disorder or physiological basis? No. But it's a pattern of behavior linked to a type of character. And I think we do identify those patterns of behavior with good reason. I think there's a good reason to identify kleptomania. And there's treatment. I think there's a good reason to identify arachnophobia, and there's treatment. And I think there is probably a basis for even identifying in a kind of sympathetic and helpful way something like psychopathic, psychopathia, whatever you say, psychopathic personality disorder. Yeah, psychopathy. Thank you. In order to help people, in as much as you can help people. Sure, I think those things are justified. But, is it a real thing? Is it a real disorder? Is it a real treatment? That's a very different philosophical question. Wouldn't it be reassuring to think, my father lied all the time through my whole youth, my whole adulthood, that his constant lying was due to something like vitamin D deficiency, some kind of disorder or problem or biochemical imbalance.
In the brain, or
right.
biochemical imbalance.
And if I don't believe that, if I don't believe he had a physiologically real or genetically real problem, then I instead have to accept this is nobody's fault but his. This is nobody's responsibility but his. And for sure, in his life, by the way, it's real easy to see how the coping mechanism developed. He became an actor as a young man. He already got a girl pregnant. He always had a high sex drive and was trying to sleep with other women. He figured out at an early age that the best way to get attention from women is to lie to them. Lying to get ahead was a behavior that came up early in his life and reinforced. And then he seems to have coped with crisis and tragedy through lying to himself and others. He learned early on the power of the lie. And he got involved with extreme political ideologies like communism very young. And not moderate communism, communist extremism, where, as was mentioned at various points, he was afraid for his life. He thought he was going to get killed because he was rolling with such extremists. That's how he tells the story. So there were a lot of reasons to lie, and obviously the sense of grandiosity. Give you an example. I forget if I told this on YouTube before, but he lied about, my whole life, he lied about the idea that like at one point the CIA were after him and the CIA took him in for questioning. And I remember when I asked him later on, so I've done a lot of reading about the CIA and how they operate. And, I knew that story, the way it was told just didn't really make sense. It's like, Barry, if the CIA wanted you, they would have got you in those conditions. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like you weren't hard to find. You know what I mean? You weren't living in a cave in the forest or something. Like, this doesn't make sense. Oh, right. And also during that time, he was paying child support. He had so many kids. So if you're the CIA, it's real easy to find someone who's sending child support checks or bank wire transfers for child support. So, he wasn't so hidden during that time in his life. So I remember at one point I really just pushed him on it, just cornered him. I said, look, you've told me this story all your life. The CIA never really talked to you, did they? They never. And, he admitted the point. So, that kind of lie. Why would a man lie to his own son that he was interviewed by the CIA? Grandiosity and ego and, there are reasons. They aren't rational reasons. They aren't objectively real reasons. But they're subjectively real reasons. And you can see a kind of life story that produces behavior. And also, what is the cure? Is the cure to put him on antidepressants or get him drugged up or something? I would say no. I'd say, ultimately the cure has to be ethical or moral or philosophical. He never found the cure. He went to his grave a complete asshole. What can I tell you? What do you say?
Well, I was just going to say this rolls into something that we were talking about the other day at a cafe. Whether morality is based on, or morality being because of luck.
Yeah.
This idea. With psychological problems, substance abuse disorders are wrapped up into it.
Yep, right.
And ultimately, I have a hard time saying to these people that it's your fault because whatever conditions they were raised in or whoever they got involved with led to these substance abuse problems. I don't think it's an innate,
right.
thing that they're born with. And many of these personality disorders, like your father's, I don't know if it's beneficial to say it's your fault or...
Yeah.
Or, you can change your pattern of behavior. You can change your thoughts on this. Anyway, I just wonder how much of it is luck and how much of it is the conditions that you grew up in and whose fault is it?
Right. But look, I think maybe that's a good question to end on, though. But you ask, is it beneficial to say this is your fault? Before, we were asking the question, is it beneficial to say this is not your fault? Mm-hmm. Like to say to someone who has depression, everyone who's spoken to a psychiatrist will, it's not you, it's your brain chemistry. That's the standard excuse. And they hand out the SSRI drugs, they hand out the meds, get you doped up. Don't worry, it's not. Well, the opposite is say, it's you. It's nobody else but you. Like ultimately this question of if you're going to be, sad or happy, it comes in. If you're going to be honest or dishonest, if you're going to be a kleptomaniac or a law-abiding citizen, it's on you, So, yeah, my message, especially when you're within the same language and culture group, it's very hard to talk to a Laotian or Cambodian person this way. When you have a culture gap in a language, it gets really hard. And I think that is a sense, even within the United States, it's very hard if you're a black person, you're an African American, and you're put in a cage in prison, and the prison psychiatrist is an elderly white man. Even though it's a smaller cultural gap, very, very hard for there to be sincere and helpful advice or sympathy or understanding, across that gap. You can imagine how awful it would be for a young black man in jail to be told by an elderly white psychiatrist, well, when I was your age, this is really not going to fly. This is not going to work at all, even with such a small cultural gap. And so for me to give advice, to a Cambodian kid or something, to some extent, a situation I've been in, this is not going to work. But sure, it's on you. Anyway, I always actually sympathized with what psychiatrists are trying to do with the DSM-5, DSM-6, with trying to put together in a useful sense what Mohammed alluded to earlier, this idea of consistent responses from an interview, giving rise to consistent diagnoses. I think that's a laudable methodology. Even if it's just for something like kleptomania. If you interview 1,000 people with kleptomania and ask them, why did you start doing this and how did you feel, what do you think about it? I think you can come to useful insights and observations about that. Those will also be very culturally specific. They're all the time, by the way. The Japanese also have a lot of psychiatry. Japanese psychoanalysis and psychiatry, it's not the same as Western European, North American. People don't do things for the same reasons. It's obvious. It's not genetic. It's cultural. These kinds of disorders and behaviors and attentions. It's very, very different culturally. Even things. I remember I read an article once. It was about quote unquote the Oedipus complex. There was another one about narcissistic personality disorder in Japan being very, very different from Europe and stuff. Why would it be the same? But I think that also gives you the clue that this is not biologically real. If you believed, what Mom was saying earlier, if you believe this is either genetic or physiological or biochemical, I understand you're not committing to it, you were broadly suggesting that, then it must be the same for Japanese people and for Europeans. Then it wouldn't be culturally correlative. It wouldn't be linked to your life experience in this way. So, or there'd be something measurable or testable or falsifiable. In addition to those cultural conditions.
I guess a point like some evidence against my proposition would be that depression rates have increased quite dramatically in the last 10 or 20 years if you survey the data. So I think I have to concede the point that it is largely due to cultural and
right. Well, subjective rather than objective.
Issues. Yeah.
Okay, psychosocial is the way to put it. But I think also it's talking about subjective rather than objective. I guess for me, the most fundamental reason why I want to debunk the approach you were giving earlier is that I think it rests on the assumption that problems must be objective to be real. And it's not true. You can have a man, I've actually seen this, you can have a man with a beautiful wife or a beautiful girlfriend. You say, objectively she's beautiful. But he feels she's not good enough for me. That's real. To him, it's subjective. And if you get to know the guy, you'll know why. For whatever reason, that's not the kind of woman he's trying. And it is completely useless to tell him, you're wrong. Objectively, she's beautiful. You know what I mean? But that's the whole psychological realm. You'd be wrong to tell me, and probably someone did, you'd be wrong to tell me, how can you be unhappy with this course at the University of Toronto on the philosophy of Plato? Objectively, it's a good course. Objectively, it's a good university. Or objectively, the other students in the class are happy. Why can't you be happy? Now, I can actually argue the objective case. Maybe objectively, it's a bad course. But again, no, subjectively, I'm miserable about it. That's the problem. At University of Victoria, the quality of education was too low. I'm subjectively unhappy with it. Yes, there's an objective component. Yes, ultimately these things pertain to real people. But I think it's a kind of scientism. It's a pseudo-scientific attitude. It's taking science outside the boundaries of what's properly scientific and saying your problem must be objective or else it's not a real problem. And no, we need a more sympathetic, analytical, and constructive attitude towards saying You're unhappy, it's for subjective reasons, and what is subjective is nevertheless, in an important sense, real.